Have you ever wanted to roleplay as a hideous dragon-slaying troll man? A man who uses a sword 3 times his height to slay demons in the darkest of dungeons. A man who was chosen by the gods to marry a clown. Hello everybody, this is Epsilon, and today I'll be reviewing what is probably the best new IP from a AAA developer for the last decade, Dragon's Dogma: Dark Arisen. Triple DA is a Western action RPG developed by Capcom who, almost as if trying to outcompete everyone in a contest no one else is running in, threw in as many popular franchises together to see what would stick. You have a pseudo-open world like that of Skyrim 4, with fighting elements of Dark Souls, Monster Hunter, and Shadow of the Colossus all mixed in together in some sort of chimeric battle system, which somehow works. DD:DA has a phenomenal fighting system. You can choose between one of 7 viable classes, with the other 2 allowing you to waste 5 minutes trying to chant a spell incantation, only for the enemy to knock you off balance, wasting your enchantment completely. The others get you involved in a high-paced, action-packed combat system with grappling goblins, tossing down giants, soaring on the back of griffins, and shooting down dragons. Most of the time, you'll encounter small fry on the world map. They usually come in groups that can be dispatched relatively quickly, especially if your party mages actually decide to do their job for once. You can opt to play as a spellcaster yourself, but then you want to be able to scale monstrous enemies, maneuver their massive bodies, and plunge your sword into their weak points. Yes, I'm racist against spellcasters. Whatever class you decide to play is up to you. You can change classes whenever you go to an inn, and each class has their own set of active and passive skills. The passive skills can be mixed and matched between classes that let you have a higher degree of customization over your character builds. This encourages you to try all different classes, at least to a small degree. Just be warned that your stats are directly related to what class you are when you level up. Each class generates a different lump sum of stat gains each level up, so if you want to min-max, keep this in mind when you change classes. For example, Assassins have the highest growth in physical attack. Sorcerers have the highest magical attack and magical defense growths in the game. While min-maxing is not required for this game, many people who want to have the best possible builds will most likely stick to either all physical classes or all magical classes and not venture out into the other group of classes for the most part. If you've leveled up to max as an assassin the whole game, you will have the maximum possible strength, which all physical attacks regardless of your current active vocation will benefit from. But if you switch over to Sorcerer or Mage, your spells will be about as effective as machine translations are with Japanese. So, what classes are there? You start out with the 3 standard ones available right away. You have your classical classes of Sword Boy, Knife Boy, and Spell Boy. When you reach level 10 and get to the first main hub of the city, you'll unlock 6 more, 3 of which are quote-unquote direct upgrades of the first 3. The other 3 are hybrid classes like Magic Knight, Magic Archer, and Assassin. Personally, my favorite is Assassin, as I really like channeling my inner American by stabbing and shooting things. All classes have things that they are good at over others. Physical classes require more maneuvering on the battlefield, whereas spellcasters have the power of nature at their fingertips, and you feel that power as you immolate any groups of enemies foolish enough to cross your path. As far as combat itself goes, you start out with your normal attack, a strong attack, and a jump button. As you gain vocation points, you'll be able to unlock more commands to use on your enemies. Some combo into one another pretty well, and there's a lot of mix and matching you can do until you get the perfect build for whatever you're going for. You can get up to 6 extra commands in addition to the 3 I mentioned earlier. 3 of these will be related to your current main weapon, and 3 of them will be related to whatever your secondary weapon is, unless you're playing as a spellcaster, that is, in which case you'll just have 6 slots for spells to wreak havoc on your enemies. Speaking of which, there are several smaller enemies you can fight throughout the game. This would be enemies like bandits, goblins, wolves, or harpies. They don't have much health compared to monstrous enemies, but they usually hunt in packs, so their strength is in their numbers. Most of these smaller enemies can be grabbed during combat, at which point, you or your party members can deal massive damage to them, kind of like the special beam cannon kamikaze attack from DBZ, only your party members don't take friendly fire this time. While I would say these types of enemies are more of a nuisance than anything, every so often you'll encounter a group of mobs that will kick your teeth in. Now the real place the combat shines is on the monstrous enemies. These are the enemies with several health bars. The enemies that are so large that you literally climb on top of them to attack their weak points. Things like dragons or giants and the like. Finding these encounters are one of the game's high points. Usually, they only take a decent amount of damage from attacking their weak points, but first, you have to get to them. Griffins tend to fly, so the best way to deal with them is to burn their wings so they can't. Chimeras have 3 body parts that attack in unison, but you can kill the tail and the goat head independently from the main lion body. For a dragon, you may need to have your party members launch you into the air to grab onto its tail so you can climb up to its chest and plunge your sword into its heart, causing it to drop out of the sky. Or you can just, launch a hell of arrows into its face till it finally falls. These are the moments you live for in this game, and if the game could just devote itself to these, it would be a perfect experience. But unfortunately, the game is not perfect. Far from it. There are many gameplay design decisions that many may refer to as questionable. The game has no easily accessible fast travel system, so you end up spending a lot of time on the road sprinting to your next destination. This wouldn't be so bad if your stamina didn't deplete as you do this, even when you're not in combat. You'll be hunched over repeatedly for half the game as you struggle to move from one destination to the next. Trash mobs tend to spawn in the same locations over and over and get more tedious than anything. So you'll learn to loathe smaller enemies. Only occasionally do you find monstrous enemies along most of the routes the game tells you to go down for the main story. Most of the actual interesting enemies only spawn in way outside the mandatory areas, and you have to search for them yourself. This is not a major issue if it's your first time in an area, but after the first time, you'll be wanting to fast travel. However, even when you unlock the item that lets you fast travel, you are very limited to where you can fast travel to. Firstly, you can only fast travel to areas with port crystals, which is very few locations in the game. Eventually, you'll be able to find some port crystals that you can place wherever you want, but there's a limit of about 5 you can find in every new game file. You can only get more by completing the game multiple times, and eventually, you'll be able to have 10 total port crystals around the map at any given time. But for most people, you will never have access to that many. For this reason, I actually recommend getting the game on PC and using less honorable methods to increase your total port crystal count. Just leave port crystals at any major locations without one already. This will vastly improve the quality of your gaming experience. Funnily enough, this was actually something they added to try and fix some of the issues when the game originally came out. There was no eternal fairy stone, so each time you wanted to teleport, well, I hope you had 10 grand to spare. And portable port crystals? Yeah, no. You only got 1. Forget about the rest. You see, these were all added in the Dark Arisen re-release, which is the only version on Steam. It substantially improves many of the issues the original game had, but even then there are still a couple of issues which I mentioned. The only actual thing that made the game marginally worse is that they changed the theme song. Does J-Rock have a place in a dark fantasy western action RPG? Probably not. But damn, does it get you hyped. Instead, now we get a more mellow song. I mean, it's not bad, but it's certainly not free. However, in return, it added one of the best dungeon crawlers in gaming history, in the form of Bitter Black Isle. Holy shit, Bitter Black Isle was an amazing experience. I recommend it over the main game itself. There's a lot of lore and world building in Bitter Black Isle, which I actually liked over the story of the main game, though to be fair, you aren't playing this game for its incredible narrative. Now, most of the story in Bitter Black Isle is directly related to the main story of the game, but it's a bit better in my opinion. Bitter Black Isle is the pinnacle of this game's dungeon crawling system. This isle is essentially one massive dungeon that you can travel through, fight random bosses, and get new loot. Loot is based off of whatever class you currently are, so you usually get an item that you can actually use. You can also save scum if you want, which I recommend. Most boss fights are worth going through, but I also must mention, bosses are very hard here. Like most of the bosses in the main game weren't that bad, but Bitter Black Isle laughs at all of them as it introduces you to a plethora of new enemies, some of which will instantly kill you as you try to figure out what the hell just happened. Many have extremely difficult to dodge attacks, and you have to be at the top of your game to survive. For this reason, you aren't really supposed to come here until you've beaten the main game. Of course, it's when we're gamers rational people. The first time I played this game, I played the original release and dropped it due to the issues I mentioned earlier. When Dark Arisen came out, I decided to try it out again, and this time I decided to do the Bitter Black Isle before I did the main game. It was a fantastic experience. Highly recommend it, even if you do feel like Yamcha fighting Cell at times. In fact, there's something satisfying about killing bosses you aren't supposed to so early on in the game, and you'll be well rewarded with loot for it too. While Bitter Black is not procedurally generated, most of the mobs you deal with are spawned in a bit more randomly than anything in the base game. You may run into fire dogs at one point, but then they'll be replaced with armored bone knights the second time you come in. Sometimes you'll even fight drakes and dragons in areas that were once safe zones. The first time you do Bitter Black, the spawns are more limited, but after clearing it one time, the whole thing becomes unlocked and you'll regularly encounter the hardest bosses in the game. You'll also get stronger loot each time you complete it after the initial clearing. The first 2 times you complete Bitter Black, you'll have some puzzles to do, but after the second time, you won't be forced to do them anymore. You have several bosses that are more weak towards certain types of damage, like bosses that are only susceptible to physical damage, or bosses that are only susceptible to magical damage. Really, there's only one that is completely immune to physical damage, but luckily there's a cheese to kill them that I accidentaled myself into, and since then, decided that would be my go-to for fighting that boss. You see, this knight here is half physical, half ghost. Half of its HP must be dealt with via physical attacks. The other half must be dealt with via magic attacks. Unfortunately, I don't have any way to deal that much magic damage to him. However, I don't need to. Much like Mufasa, this enemy's primary weakness is gravity. Wait, where was I? Oh right, Bitter Black. Go into the aisle, you'll find a bunch of lore that is directly related to the lore at the end of the main game, but I'll go over the story later. As for the dungeon itself, you basically have to find keys to unlock deeper sections of the dungeon. Your first time, you'll be required to fight several bosses, though in subsequent dungeon runs, you can skip most of them. Eventually, you'll end the dungeon fighting an extremely powerful demon who can wreak havoc on your entire team, even at max level with high tier gear. The first time you fight him, he won't be too hard, but each fight after the first, he'll have 2 forms. However, each time you defeat him, you'll also unlock 4 treasure chests that give you special loot, some of the best equipment in the game. Running the dungeon several times to get the best loot and then taking on the main story is how I originally played the game. Would recommend. The Bitter Black Isle enemies are always pretty intimidating even when you are overleveled, but it's just somehow extremely satisfying to fight the main game bosses as a demigod. Speaking of gods, let's talk about the story. There are many things to love about this game. The plot is not one of them. A dragon stole your heart and you have to kill it as revenge. Or at least that's what you think the plot is basically the whole game. There's a little bit of depth to the world lore later in the game, but for the most part, that's not why you're playing this game. Human good, dragon bad. You don't need to think too hard about it. But for your sake, let me give you a short summary of the game to the best of my memory. I began the game by creating my abomination, Guac the Sapient Avocado. After getting attacked by a dragon and having his inner seed ripped from his chest, Guac awakens to the Jarl of Whiterung talking of a dragon. Unfortunately, Guac needs his chest seed back, so he leaves town in hopes of tracking down the dragon and reclaiming it. Getting to a military encampment, Guac creates his own custom waifu, an Amazonian giantess, so he can get free piggyback rides. You see, this game has a unique take on multiplayer. Rather than playing with your friends, Capcom pulled a From Software and said, you can't. Instead, you create yourself an entity called a pawn, which other people can summon online. You can then go online and summon other people's pawns in return. Some people's pawns may come with helpful tips on fighting different enemies or knowledge of quest lines, and your own pawn will gain knowledge as well while out fighting for other players. However, universally, without fail, pawns won't stop fucking talking.
Fire works well!
Strength in numbers, Arisen.
I only hope he survived the next with my help.
Strength in numbers, Arisen. Stay at the cart's side. Grand Soren stands beyond this way castle. This place is home to harpies.
Keep well clear of those mains!
They're nimble. Watch your back.
This should change the stakes. What's this?
You'll ne'er hit them swinging blindly.
This looks interesting.
If you don't want to be a bad player, you'll sit your pawn down and tell them to shut the fuck up. Of course, if you're me, you don't do that. Anyway, the pawn system is pretty interesting. You get benefits from other people summoning yours into their world. Also, they populate the world at large, so many adventurers you see on the streets of the main city or on the road to the world map are actually pawns from other players' worlds. Also, I really like some of the love Capcom put into this game with these animations. If you go AFK for too long, the pawns might start waving in front of you to get your attention. This is actually just one of the many labors of love they put into this game. For example, ogres have tusks, which if you break off, they will graft their face in pain as they flail about. This is also one of the few games where your height actually determines the distance your attack radius extends to. Also, your body weight affects your carrying capacity. so bigger people can carry more. However, taller people may not be able to go into burrows that can only fit tiny people in them. For most people, this isn't going to be noticeable, but I thought it was something that was worth mentioning. It affects both you and your pawn, so keep that in mind during character creation. Just be warned, there are parts of the game where there's like heavy gusts of wind, and if you're a tiny ass person, you're gonna get blown away. This also works for your pawn, so if your pawn is tiny, you might need to piggyback her as you walk her across the windy valleys of the north. Anyway, as mentioned, the dragon ate Guok's heart, turning him into what the rest of the world calls an Arisen. This means that he has to go and rip the Dark Souls logo from the dragon's chest. Before he's allowed to do that though, he has to do a series of quests before he's allowed to speak with the Duke of the region this game takes place in. You can speak to this guy to get a quest from him to get a tome. Then later you can get a quest to hunt a griffin. But doing this quest now for the tome has this NPC show up to help you slay the I wasn't even aware you could kill the griffin here. So did I like just skip the rest of this quest line? Okay, well, that's news to me. So, anyway, once you complete enough requests, you'll finally be introduced to the Duke, who will also request you do even more requests so that you can progress through the story. So Guok walks through the castle gates so he can seek an audience with my lord, what a beautiful specimen of a man that is. Perhaps you would be so kind as to give me your name. The court jester, I would give you my heart had it not already been taken from me. True love, if there's ever been. After having an uncomfortable meeting with the castle's garden triad, Guok travels out to kill more monsters for the Duke, all so that he can get closer to the court jester. At one point, Guok is called to a late-night meeting by the Queen, where we end up getting shield heroed. Jester, I promise you, this isn't what it looks like. After several restless nights in prison, the wench comes to help us escape. Somehow, no one questions this, despite Guok being so well known now. No one brings it up, and the Duke seems to have forgotten. Maybe that's for the best. Anyway, the game basically halts story progression by doing a bunch of quests every time the game seems to progress its plot. Basically, these quests are go to X and bring back item, or go to Y and kill thing. After killing a bunch of giant monsters and stopping some cultists, we finally get to where we are allowed to go and fight the dragon. Except wait. No, they couldn't! The dragon has stolen Guok's beloved! So, Guok will steal the dragon's life.
The turning back is past. The world will have its answer. You or me. Death or life beyond. The will to...
The jester is saved, but the kingdom has collapsed. That doesn't matter as long as Guok's husbando is safe. The game is finally over. Except it's not. What's going on here? The world seems to be collapsing more than anything.
You met with the dragon. No human hands could fell that beast. No. You took the dragon's bargain. You conspired with it to wither me and usurp my seat as Duke. But you'll not be quit of me so easily!
So, basically, this world works in cycles. The Arisen will be challenged by the dragon, or the dragon will kidnap the Arisen's beloved. The Arisen will be offered immense wealth and power by the dragon, but in return, the Arisen will have to forsake the lover. The Duke was one such Arisen, which had began to eat away at him mentally. It's why he seems mentally unstable the whole game. You too can choose the same option the Duke did, but then the game ends prematurely. Upon killing the dragon, the Duke becomes really old. The Duke believes no one would be able to best the dragon, and as such, you must have taken a deal that resulted in his current situation. Therefore, you've essentially become an enemy of the state, because the Duke has no balls. Upon traveling through the real final dungeon, you somehow also cross genres from Western RPG to JRPG as you confront God, because you can't have an RPG made by a Japanese developer without God being the final boss for some reason. Here, you find out that the dragon himself was also once an Arisen, and God is also an Arisen. This world, as I mentioned, works in cycles. The Arisen will be challenged by a dragon. The Arisen will be tempted by the dragon. Once the Arisen proves his virtue and strength against the dragon, the Arisen will meet God. If the Arisen is strong enough, he will then become the new God. If he's not strong enough, he will become a new dragon, who will then go out and seek the next Arisen. The gods in this world progress the world's development, but at some point, the world will eventually become stagnant. As such, a new god is required every so often, and that is why this world operates in cycles. It's a way to ensure strong and virtuous gods each time a cycle is completed, or something like that. That's what I got out of the story anyway. As I mentioned, the plot isn't really why you play this game. Playing it the first time, I basically ignored the plot the whole game, and it was only after seeing the entire game that I actually realized the plot was a lot deeper than I originally thought. I still wouldn't call it the best plot in RPGs, but it's definitely more complex than you would think a story about Dragon Bad would normally be. As far as the Bitter Black Isle story goes, you have a maiden who's lost her memories. She requests you help her recover them by completing the Bitter Black Isle dungeon complex. As you go through this dungeon, you are slowly introduced to the master of the dungeon. He too was once Arisen. However, he had great despair from his venture. The dragon was originally the former Arisen, who was something of a mother figure from. However, she lost in a fight against the world's god and turned into the next dragon. In turn, she made this man the next Arisen. He set out with his mother figure's pawn, who slowly became more human. He fell in love with her, but it wasn't to last. He eventually discovered the truth of the cycle of the dragon and the Arisen. When given a choice between slaying his mother figure to save the woman he loved, he decided everything should be damned. As a result, the pawn's life was forfeit as payment to his desire. Bitter Black Isle was made, and he was reborn as Daimon. The real reason you are here is that the spirit of his pawn wishes to see him freed, even though she doesn't remember that purpose. She brings you to the isle in order to set his spirit free by slaying Daimon. Upon doing that, you watch their spirits reunite in the afterlife. All in all, the game actually has quite a decent amount of lore to it, and a lot of interesting things in it if you're paying attention. Unfortunately, during your first playthrough, most of it will go over your head, or you'll just not be paying attention to it, which, to be fair, is completely understandable. Even at the end of the day, it's not the most engaging plot to exist, but it is a bit deeper than you think when you're going into it initially. At the end of the day, it really is the amazing boss fights and dungeon crawling that the game excels at. For those alone, I recommend the game, and if the main game is just annoying due to the design issues I've mentioned, then I fully recommend just going to Bitter Black Isle and struggling through that, as you'll be engaged in constant difficult fights the entire time. No game does boss fights quite as engaging as Dragon's Dogma. This game should be held on a pedestal for that alone when it comes to game development. I hope when the sequel finally comes out that it won't have forgotten what made it good while improving on the systems that it didn't do so well on. And with that, I want to thank you for watching this video. If it pleases you, please go out and try Dragon's Dogma Dark Arisen for yourself. The game is a masterwork, it can't go wrong. And as I record this, the Steam Summer Sale is ongoing, so the game is around $5. Please try it out if you think you'll enjoy it.